On 12 February 1963, Hattie Jacques was surprised by Eamon Andrews at the BBC television theatre. To viewers, it looked like a warm and rather splendid evening of British television. The familiar red book appeared, colleagues gathered, and one of the nation's beloved comic actresses was gently led into her own life story. But behind the smiles, something far less tidy was unfolding. By then, Hattie was already a fixture in British comedy. Audiences knew her voice, her timing, her commanding presence, and that unmistakable air of a woman who could silence a hospital ward with one raised eyebrow. In Carry On, she had become the sort of figure people felt they had always known. Solid, reliable, funny, without appearing to ask for laughter. Yet, the woman being celebrated that night was living through a private crisis almost no viewer could see. Her marriage to actor John Le Mesurier, begun in 1949, had become painfully strained. Her relationship with John Schofield had brought attention, affection, and danger into a household already full of quiet cracks. In another country, perhaps, it might have become a public storm. In Britain, naturally, everyone remained terribly polite. That was part of the sadness. John Le Mesurier appeared on the programme as her husband, composed and courteous. The atmosphere was affectionate, but there was a strange weight beneath it. The audience saw a beloved performer receiving tribute. They did not see the woman who longed to be desired as more than a comic matron, more than a useful presence in someone else's scene. This is where Hattie Jacques becomes more than a familiar face from old films. Her story is not simply about fame, marriage, or scandal. It is about a woman loved by millions, yet perhaps not fully seen by those who laughed with her. On that February night, Britain thought it was looking back at Hattie's life, but the most important part of that life was still hidden in the wings. For many British viewers, Hattie Jacques does not first appear as a biography. She appears as a memory, a hospital corridor, a starched uniform, a face that could look both severe and faintly amused, and that famous feeling that someone in charge had just entered the room. By the late 1950s, Britain was changing quickly. Television was moving into more homes, cinema was still a family outing, and comedy had become a way of making post-war life feel a little less grey. In 1958, Hattie joined the Carry On world in Carry On Sergeant. A year later, Carry On, Nurse helped fix her in the public imagination as a figure of formidable authority. The joke was never merely that she was large, or loud, or strict. The joke was that she seemed to believe absolutely in order, while everyone around her cheerfully misbehaved. That was very British. Chaos, but with a clipboard. Audiences loved her because she brought control to nonsense. She could play a matron, a headmistress, a woman behind a desk, or any official figure who looked as though she had already disapproved of you before you opened your mouth. Yet there was warmth beneath it. Hattie's sternness was rarely cruel. It had a twinkle, even when the script pretended not to notice. For older viewers, this is why she still feels familiar. She belongs to the front room, to Saturday night repeats, to Carry On films watched with parents, grandparents, and a cup of tea that somehow survived every double entendre. She was part of a shared national language, but affection can become a prison. The more Britain loved Hattie as matron, the less room there seemed to be for Hattie herself. A character had become a symbol, and symbols are not always kind to the people inside them. So the question begins here. Did Britain love Hattie Jacques, or did it simply love the version of her that wore the uniform? Before Hattie Jacques became the woman with the raised eyebrow and the immovable clipboard, she was Josephine Edwina Jacques, born in Sandgate, Kent, in 1922. It is useful to place that fact here, not at the beginning. Dates matter, but with Hattie, the interesting question is what those years did to her. Her father, Robin, died in a flying accident when she was still very young. After that, her mother Mary brought the family to London. Mary loved the theatre and took her daughter to live performances. For a child who had already known absence, the stage offered something wonderfully unreasonable. People could vanish, return, sing, argue, and still be applauded at the end. Then came the war, in 1939. Hattie was 17, old enough to understand that Britain had entered a different sort of story. She worked as a nurse and later as a welder. It is an extraordinary detail when remembered beside the Carry On image. Before she wore comic uniforms, she had known real ones. Before she played women who commanded wards and offices, she had seen discipline used for survival, not simply laughter. By 1944, she had found her way to the Players' Theatre in London. It was not a glamorous path, and perhaps that was the point. The Players was music hall, revue, Latinite discipline, old songs, sharp timing, and an audience that would not be fooled by empty charm. Hattie learned to hold a room there. She learned that comedy was not noise, but control. That early life gave her something audiences later mistook for mere force. Her authority on screen did not come from size alone. It came from having lived through a Britain where women did practical, difficult work, then came home and were expected to be cheerful. So when viewers later laughed at Matron, they were also seeing something older. A survivor, wrapped in comedy, pretending not to make a fuss. Long before television made Hattie Jacques a face everyone recognized, radio made her a presence people trusted. That distinction matters. On radio, there was no matron's uniform, no hospital corridor, no visual joke about the space she occupied. There was only voice, timing, and the wonderful danger of a pause held half a second longer than expected. After joining the Players' Theatre in 1944, Hattie moved through a post-war entertainment world that still belonged as much to microphones as cameras. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, BBC radio was not background noise, it was furniture. Families sat with it, ate beside it, and let it bring the outside world into homes still recovering from rationing and rubble. Hattie reached national audiences through programs such as It's That Man Again, Educating Archie, and Hancock's Half Hour. Each demanded a different skill. ITMA carried the speed of wartime and post-war radio comedy. Educating Archie placed her among performers who could make absurdity sound perfectly respectable. Hancock's Half Hour brought her into contact with a sharper, more modern melancholy, the sort of comedy that laughed because complaining directly would have been terribly bad form. This was where her craft became clear. Hattie could suggest disapproval with a syllable. She could sound wounded, grand, flirtatious, practical, or faintly terrifying without needing the camera to help. Eric Sykes, who encountered her during this world of stage and radio, later remembered being struck by the elegance with which she moved and performed. That matters, because elegance is not the word lazy memory usually gives her. Radio allowed Hattie to be heard before she was judged. It proved that her comedy lived in intelligence, not just appearance. Yet, once the screen claimed her, another story began. The camera loved her authority, but the industry often narrowed it. The voice had opened doors. The image would open more, then quietly begin to close them. By the time the 1960s settled into their brisk, slightly smoky stride, Hattie Jacques had become one of those performers Britain did not have to explain to itself. She simply arrived, and everyone understood the temperature of the room. In Carry On Sergeant in 1958, her part was still modest. In Carry On Nurse the following year, the matronly authority began to harden into public memory. Then came other variations. The formidable schoolmistress, the non-nonsense official, the woman who looked as though paperwork itself had offended her. By Carry On Doctor in 1967, and later Carry On Matron in 1972, the association was almost complete. Hattie and authority had become a national joke, but a fond one. What made it work was not volume. Many performers can be loud. Hattie was precise. She knew when to hold a look, when to land a line without appearing to enjoy it, and when to let the silliness around her grow more ridiculous by remaining perfectly serious. In the Carry On world, that was a rare gift. She could be the straightest face in the room, and somehow the funniest. Then there was Eric Sykes. In their television partnership, especially through Sykes, and later Sykes, Hattie showed a warmer, more domestic side. She was not only the woman in charge, she could be sisterly, exasperated, loyal, practical, and gently absurd. Their screen household felt recognisably British. Small irritations, neighbourly nonsense, and the sense that a cup of tea might solve everything, even when it plainly could not. This was Hattie's golden period. Radio had trained her, film had fixed her image, and television brought her into the front room. Yet success carried a shadow. The better she became at being unforgettable, the easier it became for the industry to remember only one version of her. The difficulty with a beloved comic image is that it rarely asks permission before taking over a life. Hattie Jacques was admired, warmly and often sincerely, yet the admiration came with a label already attached. She was the big woman, the stern woman, the matron, the battle axe, the official who could flatten a room before breakfast. Audiences did not mean harm by loving her that way. Most of them were simply delighted by her skill. But entertainment in those years could be very narrow with women who did not fit the decorative mould. If a woman was not presented as young, fragile, or conventionally glamorous, the script often made her useful in some other way. She could be bossy, she could be comic, she could frighten men, which allowed men to laugh and feel safely frightened. Hattie rose above that material because she had intelligence. She could turn a blunt stereotype into a character with rhythm, warmth, and craft. Still, the pattern mattered. The more she played formidable women, the more formidable she was presumed to be. The screen gave her power, then quietly denied her softness. This is where the public Hattie and the private Hattie begin to separate. On screen, she looked unshakable. Off-screen, friends and colleagues remembered a woman capable of great kindness, practical help, and loyalty. She invited fellow performers into her home, supported younger colleagues, and was often described as generous with both time and affection. That does not fit neatly with the cartoon memory of Matron, and that is precisely the point. The tragedy was not that Hattie was unloved. She was loved. The tragedy was that she was often loved through a shape that had already been chosen for her. When audiences laughed, they saw authority. What they did not always see was vulnerability. And perhaps that is why the story behind the marriage matters. It was not a separate scandal. It was part of the same question. Who was allowed to see Hattie Jacques as a woman, not merely as an institution? Hattie Jacques married John Le Mesurier in 1949, and for a time they seemed an almost perfect comedy pairing off-screen as well as on. Both were gifted, both understood performance, and both possessed that particular English talent for making discomfort sound civilized. But marriages do not fail only in dramatic moments. Sometimes they fade in rooms where nothing obvious has happened. By the early 1960s, Hattie and John were living with an emotional distance that fame did not soften. Her relationship with John Schofield entered that distance, and with it came affection, risk, and a painful confusion of loyalty. It is tempting, from the safety of later decades, to make the story simple. A wife betrayed a husband, a marriage broke, a scandal followed, but people are rarely that tidy, especially in private. Hattie was not merely chasing excitement. She was a woman who had spent years being loved by the public as a comic force, while longing to be wanted as something gentler, more intimate, and more ordinary. John Le Mesurier's response became part of the story's strange sadness. He was remembered as remarkably calm, even generous, in circumstances that would have made many people less noble before breakfast. His composure can look almost comic from a distance, but only because English restraint often does. Beneath it was hurt. In 1963, when Hattie was celebrated on This Is Your Life, the fault lines were already visible to those close enough to see them. By 1965, the marriage had ended in divorce. The relationship with Schofield did not give her the lasting peace she may have imagined. Few such arrangements do, despite what hopeful hearts tell themselves at inconvenient times. This part of Hattie's life should not be used to punish her. It should be used to understand the loneliness behind the laughter. The question is not simply what she did. It is what she needed, and why so few people seemed able to see it in time. After the public storms and private disappointments, Hattie Jacques carried on working. The phrase is almost too neat, considering the films that helped define her, but it is true. She returned to Carry On, appeared in Carry On Doctor, Carry On Again Doctor, Carry On Matron, and later Carry On Dick in 1974. She also remained part of the television landscape through Sykes, where her partnership with Eric Sykes kept her familiar, domestic, and warmly absurd. Yet, by the 1970s, the world around her had changed. British comedy was shifting. The old music hall rhythms, the radio discipline, the post-war innuendo, and the cosy front-room certainties were beginning to look like relics from another Britain. Hattie still belonged to that world, but the world itself was moving away. Her health also became more fragile. She had known professional pressure, personal strain, and the ordinary exhaustion that comes when a performer must keep arriving cheerfully, even when life offstage is anything but light. She died of a heart attack in October 1980, at only 58. For many viewers, it felt much too soon. Not loudly tragic, perhaps, just quietly unfair. And yet Hattie Jacques should not be remembered only through sadness. She helped shape British comedy across stage, radio, film, and television. She was not simply matron, not simply a joke about authority, size, or disapproval. She was a performer of timing, generosity, control, and unexpected warmth. She could make a scene funnier by refusing to chase the laugh. That is why she remains. In old repeats, in family memories, in that familiar cry of, "Ooh, matron," and in the work of later comic actresses who inherited some part of the space she helped create. If you remember Hattie Jacques, or another British comedy face you feel deserves to be seen again, do share their name in the comments. She made Britain laugh, but perhaps now we can also let her be fully seen.